the silence from which thoughts are born. Sometimes I sit in silence and try to catch that moment, the one right before a thought is born, when consciousness feels like a still surface of water, no ripples, no reflections. And then, suddenly, somewhere in the depths, a movement appears, a word, an image, a hint of an idea. We call it a thought. But what is it really? Where does it appear before it becomes a word? And who is the one that notices it? Consciousness is the closest thing to us in the entire universe, and the most mysterious. We can observe galaxies billions of light years away, but we still can't explain why we feel that we exist. This mystery seems simple. I think, therefore I am. But if you look deeper, that's not an answer. It's a question we've been asking for over 2,500 years. Chapter 1. The first attempts to understand. The first philosophers, looking inward, tried to understand what makes us alive from within. Plato said that the soul is a self-moving motion. Aristotle called it the form of a living body, not something separate, but that which makes matter alive. Back then there was no idea of the brain as the source of consciousness. Consciousness was the breath of life, pneuma, spark, psyche. Centuries passed. In the Middle Ages, consciousness was tied to the soul, and the soul to a divine origin. Thoughts were seen as something implanted in us from above. But in the 17th century, one man changed everything. René Descartes, philosopher, mathematician, anatomist. He wasn't searching for God, but for certainty. What can one know for sure if one doubts everything? He doubted the senses. They could deceive. He doubted perception. It could be an illusion. But one thing remained beyond doubt, the very fact that he was doubting. Cogito ergo sum, he said. I think, therefore I am. At that moment, consciousness stopped being metaphysics. It became a fact of experience, something that proves itself by simply being. But Descartes also created a new mystery. If consciousness is immaterial and the body is material, how do they affect each other? How does a thought make a hand move? How do neurons create the feeling of I? This mystery got a name, the problem of consciousness. And ever since, it has haunted philosophy, psychology, and neuroscience. Chapter 2. The birth of the scientific view. By the 19th century, humanity decided if we can't find the soul, we must look for the mechanism. Science stopped speaking of spirit. It began to speak of the brain. Physiologists like Hermann von Helmholtz studied the speed of nerve impulses. Freud tried to look beneath the surface, into the unconscious. Psychologists like Wilhelm Wundt opened the first laboratories, where they tried to measure perception and attention. But then, something shifted. American behaviorists declared consciousness cannot be measured, therefore it doesn't exist as a scientific object. And for almost half a century, it vanished from science. Experiments focused only on what could be observed from the outside: behavior, reactions, stimuli. The inner world became a black box. Science seemed to turn away from the subject itself, the observer. But a human without consciousness is like a text without a reader. And the more neuroscientists studied the brain, the more they felt something was missing. Chapter 3. The Return of Consciousness. Everything changed at the end of the 20th century, when computers began to resemble the brain, and the brain, in turn, began to resemble a computer. Cognitive science emerged, a new field uniting neuroscientists, linguists, philosophers, and programmers. It set for itself an ambitious goal: to understand how consciousness arises from matter. That's when a philosopher named David Chalmers stepped onto the stage. He was the one who formulated what we now call the hard problem of consciousness. He said, "We can explain how the brain distinguishes colors, how it processes sounds, how it reacts to pain. But no one can explain why it feels like something. Why does red feel red? Why is pain not just a signal, but a suffering? Where does the taste of experience come from? That which makes perception subjective." That is the hard problem. Not because it's technically difficult, but because it might not be solvable within physics at all. Chalmers suggested that consciousness might be a fundamental property of the universe, on par with space, time, and energy. And perhaps every electron, every particle carries within it a tiny spark of subjectivity, a primitive form of feeling. This idea became known as panpsychism. According to Chalmers, the brain doesn't create consciousness, it organizes it, focuses it, like a lens concentrates light. This thought shocked the scientific community. But from that moment on, the question of consciousness could no longer be silenced. Chapter 4. Thoughts as a biological process. Modern neuroscience, of course, has taken a different path. It doesn't search for a soul, it searches for mechanisms. When we think, tiny electric flashes light up the brain. Billions of neurons transmit impulses. And somewhere in this chaos, order begins to emerge. In the 1980s, physiologist Benjamin Libet conducted a famous experiment. He asked people to move their hand at a random moment while recording their brain activity. And he discovered something strange. The brain decided to move a fraction of a second before the person became aware of that decision. Consciousness, it turns out, is a delay, a commentary on what has already happened, as if we're watching a movie that the brain is projecting with a slight lag. If that's true, then who makes decisions? Us or the brain? And where does the line lie between the conscious and the automatic? Neuroscientists like Stanislas Dehaene and Giulio Tononi are trying to measure the level of consciousness through models of information integration. They say, the more the brain can combine separate signals into a unified experience, the higher the degree of awareness. But no instrument can tell what that brain feels from the inside. Even if it lights up on an MRI scan, we only see the footprints of a thought, not the thought itself. Consciousness remains a shadow, something science can see, but never catch. Chapter 5. The illusion of the self. We're used to thinking there's someone at the center of our experience, an observer. I, the one who sees, thinks, decides. But neuroscience increasingly says that center doesn't exist. The brain is not a theater with a spectator sitting in the middle. It's a network of processes, millions of neurons creating temporary maps of reality. Each believes it's the main character. None of them know about the others. When their signals intersect, the illusion of a continuous self appears. But if you look closer, it's more of a montage than a story. Francis Crick, one of the discoverers of DNA, once said a line that caused an uproar. "You are nothing more than the behavior of your neurons. No soul, no inner center, just electricity and chemistry." And yet, somehow, from this electricity emerges the feeling of being. Why does it appear? Perhaps because without it, the system wouldn't survive. The eye is a convenient interface, a way to focus attention, plan, make decisions. Like an icon on a computer desktop, that shows where my files are, but contains nothing itself. Consciousness creates the self as an operational metaphor, so it can manage the body, memory, and choices. And then we begin to mistake the metaphor for reality. Chapter 6. Between the conscious and the unconscious. But the I is only a small part of the field. Most of the mind remains in shadow. Our decisions ripen somewhere deeper, in the quiet of the subconscious, where there are no words, but there are patterns, habits, memories. Freud was the first to dare to look there, calling this abyss the unconscious. But modern research shows that the unconscious is neither an enemy nor a mystery. It's simply the rest of the brain. When you're driving a car and suddenly realize you've been thinking of something else the whole time, that's the unconscious at work, acting on your behalf. Consciousness, meanwhile, is just a thin layer, a beam of light on the surface of the ocean. We only see what that light touches. Neurophysiologist Antonio Damasio once wrote, "Consciousness is not control, it is reflection. It doesn't run the process, it records the result. But in that reflection lies meaning. Because only by reflecting do we realize that we are alive." Maybe consciousness is not a motor, but a mirror in which the universe sees itself. Chapter 7. The Eastern View. Consciousness as an ocean. While Western science tried to understand how the brain creates consciousness, Eastern philosophy asked a different question. Does it create it at all? In Buddhist and Vedic texts, consciousness doesn't belong to the person. It's not a function of the brain. It's the medium in which the brain appears. The body is like a wave. Consciousness is the ocean. When the wave disappears, the water remains. The West searches for a source in neurons. The East in the fabric of existence itself. Neurophysiologist Carl Pribram once suggested that perhaps the brain is not a generator, but a hologram. It interprets a field of information, rather than producing it, like a radio receiver tuned to the frequency of the universe. If that's true, then consciousness isn't inside the skull. It's everywhere. We're simply caught on the right wavelength. Meditative states, in which a person feels a sense of unity with everything, might be those rare moments when the receiver goes beyond the individual signal and hears the full static of the cosmos. There is no "I think." There is simply "I am." Chapter 8. The Artificial Mind. Reflection or simulation? Today, we're building systems that write, speak, and reason, and we ask, can they be conscious? But if consciousness isn't mere computation, but experience, then what exactly could a computer experience? Philosopher John Searle called this the Chinese room. A machine might flawlessly imitate understanding, yet it doesn't understand anything. It knows the rules, but not what it means to be. And yet, year after year, artificial neural networks grow closer to us, not in structure, but in reflection. We've created a digital mirror, one we can gaze into not with our eyes, but with text. And perhaps in that reflection, humanity begins to ask again the oldest of questions. What makes the living truly alive? What makes awareness aware? Maybe AI will never become truly sentient, but it might help us see that we ourselves are not as conscious as we like to think. Chapter 9. At the Edge of Life and Consciousness. We usually assume that consciousness exists only as long as the brain is alive. But what if that's just a simplified version of a much deeper reality? In 2013, a team led by neuroscientist Jimo Borjigin at the University of Michigan discovered a strange phenomenon. In rats whose hearts and breathing had stopped for about 30 seconds after death, their brains showed a sudden surge of activity, not fading, but flaring. Later, similar bursts were recorded in humans who had experienced clinical death. They described visions of light, a sense of leaving the body, encounters, a realm beyond time. You can explain it chemically, a flood of dopamine and serotonin, a mix of hallucination and memory. But there's another possibility. Perhaps in the moment of death, consciousness doesn't vanish. It expands beyond its neural form. Philosopher Thomas Metzinger once wrote that consciousness is a model of the world, built for survival. But maybe at the end of that journey, the model simply becomes transparent, and what we call the self suddenly sees not itself, but the very field of awareness in which it always resided. Chapter 10. What if consciousness isn't a stream, but an ocean? We tend to think of consciousness as something that flows, a river moving from birth to death. But what if it's the other way around? What if we are the river, and consciousness is the sea into which we dissolve? Physicist David Bohm believed that reality is woven from a folded fabric, an implicate order. Consciousness, he said, is not the product of matter, but the way matter unfolds itself. The brain only makes a temporary ripple on the surface, a wave that thinks it's separate. But sooner or later, the wave returns to the ocean. Perhaps death is not an ending, but a shift in perspective. We stop looking from within the form and begin to see the fabric itself. Epilogue. Searching for the one who searches. Consciousness is a mirror in which reality looks at itself. We build telescopes to see the universe and microscopes to understand the brain, but maybe the only instrument capable of truly knowing consciousness is consciousness itself. When we ask, "What is consciousness?" the one who asks is the answer. Perhaps it is never born and never dies. It simply changes the modes of perception: dream, waking, life, death, memory, silence. Everything we call experience is just a way the infinite field comes to know itself. So maybe the real question isn't, what is consciousness? But rather, who is asking right now?